Welcome to this evening's event. I say evening because it's evening in the Nordic countries and elsewhere in Europe, but it's morning, US Pacific time, where Carter is in Seattle, Washington. Welcome, Carter.
Thank you for having me on, Johan.
Yeah, thank you for being with us. And we also have Erika with us, who is also here in the Nordics. Welcome.
Thank you.
Voices of those affected by non-medical genital cutting of children is the topic of this discussion. A very serious and sensitive one, not too often heard, and not in a format like this. We decided not to stream the discussion live, but we're recording it Wednesday, about 24 hours before release to the public, on Thursday, the 17th of September 2020. I will give a brief introduction in Swedish, then switch back to English to let the discussion take place. Det här evenemanget är specifikt riktat till beslutsfattare och politiker som behandlar och beslutar om policy och linjedragning för arbete för främjande av genital autonomi för barn. Evenemanget är också öppet för allmänheten, för alla som är intresserade. Vår diskussion utgör del 2 i en kunskapshöjande serie om temat, där första delen behandlar temat ur ett bioetiskt, akademiskt, vetenskapligt perspektiv. Och det är i första hand den delen som utgör kunskapsunderlaget för ett hållbart beslutsfattande om barns genitala autonomi. Men det är lätt att tala om rön, belägg, referenser, statistik och siffror utan att se människan bakom och höra den drabbades röst. Det får vi göra idag i ett viktigt komplement till den första delen. This event forms part of an awareness raising series where the first part was held in May with bioethicist Brian Earp from Yale University and had the title Ask the Bioethicist About Children's Genital Autonomy. In this second part, we will look at the topic from a different perspective. We will listen to the voices of those affected. It will be possible to ask questions to the discussion participants, which they will answer at a later moment, and we will put the info for that in the description field for the video. First, I would like to share with you two sentences, two statements that I often hear when discussing this topic. One very common one is, at least here in Northern Europe, that I have never heard anyone complain about being cut or being circumcised or whatever term you use for it, and thus concluding that so it can't be that bad or it can't really be that much of a problem. The other one is someone that has been cut or circumcised, that on several occasions has been saying, well, this was done to me and I have never had a problem with it. Also, again, possibly meaning so others might also not have a problem with it. Carter, what would you say when you hear these statements that I just shared?
First off, those are excellent questions. And let me answer the first one, because I've recently gone through the experience myself of not being able to speak out on this topic. And in order to be able to start talking about your feelings around this as a man, you really have to dissolve your ego completely, because it's such a personal topic, right? When I start discussing like the harm that I've experienced, and it's related to my genitals and things like that, it's just an incredibly uncomfortable topic for a man to start bringing up, for any human being, right? To start saying, you know, I'm not comfortable with the fact that I had a genital modification surgery as an infant. I wasn't, you know, able to consent to this. It impacted this very unique part of my body, right? This unique component, facet of my humanity, my sexuality. And so in order for a man to start speaking up on this, he has to have absolutely zero fear in life at all related to this topic. And so to get to that point, there's unique circumstances that have to happen for you to start, not just speaking up about infant circumcision in general, but speaking up about your own personal harm that you've experienced. And how I reached this stage is I just went through an incredible degree of suffering. My own personal suffering led me to a place where I felt like I had nothing left to lose at all by speaking up about this, because it couldn't get worse for me, right? I didn't really care anymore if people would judge me or if people would, belittle me and things like that. And that's happened many, many times. So this is another reason why it's difficult for men to speak out. Because typically the community that you're in, in America, many men are circumcised, and many mothers and fathers have circumcised their children. And so in order to speak out about this, you really have to challenge other people as well. And this leads to some very difficult and contentious conversations. And so similarly in Europe, the communities where these ritual circumcisions are taking place, this is a confrontational experience for a lot of these men. And they're going to have to start challenging their culture, their people, their family, right? Think of how difficult that is. When I had to go, I initially came out about this. It's like a coming out experience, right? And so I had to start speaking with my family on this matter. And that was brutal for me. And the response that I got was not, very welcoming at first. And
sorry, Carter, was the coming out experience, was it a long road for you until you realized yourself that you are now telling?
The road was not very long for when I first started understanding the consequences of having been circumcised as an infant and what that meant to me. Very quickly, I started bringing these conversations up with my parents, but I didn't really go into the depth yet that I felt personally on this topic. It was very surface level at first. And over time, that conversation really evolved, and I shared with them the true degree of harm that I felt because of this. So, and I think a lot of men leave it at that surface level, right? They're like, mom, dad, or anyone in their life, I'm upset that this happened to me. But they never really go and reveal the true depth of the trauma that they feel around this topic. And so I think, based on those factors that I just broke down, that's primarily the reason why you don't hear men speaking up about this. So just to summarize that real quickly, first of all, in order to recognize that this was harmful to you, you have to do a lot of deep digging and become very emotionally vulnerable yourself in order to even be able to recognize this trauma. It really depends on the culture that you're in the situation that you're in. In America, this has been so normalized that it just goes right over your head until you explicitly go out of your way to investigate it. And that's what happened with me. I started recognizing that there were, something wasn't right anatomically with my penis. I noticed that I didn't really have good sensational feedback. And that led me to start exploring why possibly could that be. And I quickly looked into the anatomical loss that takes place with circumcision. And, my jaw dropped, and I was very defensive at first. Immediately after starting to understand that these are important structures that were removed from me, I immediately went on the defensive. And it was an all-out defensive in my own mind, right? I went and I looked at the medical benefits, right? I went and I valued that so much. I was like, oh, well, at least it decreases this. And I justified that in my mind. And everything that I could to justify it, right? Girls like it. It's cleaner. my ego was doing everything that it possibly could to rationalize this. And it was such an intense experience. I really can't translate that or emphasize that enough. My philosophical framework on everything was being radically challenged. And in order to cope with it, I was putting up these very strong defense mechanisms. But at one point, the logical side won out. I simply could not deny that there was a radical difference between my penis as a circumcised man and an intact man's penis. And the more that I looked into it, the more the gravity of the situation started sinking in for me, right? This isn't just a little snip. This isn't just a little bit of loose tissue that was removed. This operation isn't this painless experience. This is a very significant event for me, and it deserves a lot of attention. And that's when I started really diving deeper into this topic. But in order for me to get there, it took so much trauma to even be in exploring my own body and my own self and things like that, that most men are going to stop, right? The minute these thoughts start invading your mind, you just want to disassociate and move away as quickly as possible. That's what I experienced. I can't speak for all other men, but that is what I experienced. I wanted to move away from the reality of the situation as much as I possibly could. I wanted to trivialize it. I wanted to diminish it, anything I possibly could to rationalize what was done to me. My brain was trying to do. And I think it's just a primal self-defense mechanism to protect my ego and protect my worldview and my thoughts.
Yeah, I suppose that would be a very common thing to do, to try to rationalize it that way. And also, when you are telling this, what I'm thinking to myself, that apart from the personal level, also the social or societal or regional context for this must look quite different in the US from Europe and from Northern Europe, because it's so common, at least, well, or only for men or boys, it's very commonly done. It is thinking about among newborn boys nowadays in the US, but still for the overall population it is very common. So that the dynamics for handling this on a societal level is very different there from here. I would suppose that the cognitive dissonance is very compact, so to say, in the US, in the form of that because this was done to me, or because I had this done to my son, or because I'm a medical doctor and perform this on thousands of babies, it must be good. It can't be questioned, and it must carry on. And as you said, you try to rationalize that in that way. While in Europe and especially Northern Europe, it's almost exclusively religious minorities who do this, and the dynamic is different. Then the discussion risks much more to fall into talk about xenophobia or Islamophobia or anti-Semitism or something like that. That was just a thought I've got. Yeah,
absolutely.
I think that's the biggest difference between you and my boyfriend, because in my boyfriend's case, it was done because of Muslim tradition, but he's always grown up with guys around him who aren't circumcised. So for him, it started when it started very early on, that he knew that something was different, he was missing something. And when the other guys in his school and all that started talking about sex and that, oh, well, this feels so good and this feels great, the only thing he thought was like, I can't feel that. And I think the problem is that when people say that, oh, they've never heard anyone complain, or, yeah, well, I'm circumcised and I don't have any issues with it, the ones who say that they've never heard anyone complain about it it's as you say, it's such a difficult topic to talk about. But I know my boyfriend, he wakes me up in the middle of the night because he's in so much pain because of this, that he can't sleep and he doesn't know what to do with himself, just because it hurts so bad. And that's not the case for all circumcised guys, but just knowing that that is a risk is something that it's a cause for concern, and that's why it should be discussed if this is a practice that has to stop.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I was thinking about what you said, Erica. Not everyone suffers from this, and this is also something we shall remember that, and this goes for both men and women, that not everyone suffers. There are a lot of people that have been genitally cut, even as children, even without their own consent, who still feel that it's all right. Either they are indifferent to it, or some of them might even feel that it's a positive thing. They might say that it doesn't bother me at all. Possibly. Some of them are in the state of denial as well, as you were speaking, Carter, but some of them might also not have any problem at all. And what the way I would tie this discussion together with our first part in this series is what Brian Earp said in May. He said that my work is to provide moral reasons, even for those parents that are fully okay with their own body, even though they were cut, not to continue this tradition to their own children.
Absolutely. And so I think, Brian Earp is really on the right path there. And so for one man, right, a penile modification surgery where specialized erotic tissues and structures being removed from his penis, that might totally be something for him, right? But we should obviously not default to that or impose that on a child, because I want to tell you something. I am not a man who wants a penile modification surgery at all. That's actually a radically wicked and perverse thing to have been done to my body. That's how I view this, right? I'm like, how is it possible that somebody could have strapped me down as a child and excised my genital structures at 1 day old? That is the most wildly perverse and damaging thing that I could imagine being done to myself. And I feel violently abused by this. And so even if parents, did believe that penile modifications were in the best interest of their child, why would it be done in this violent and perverse way as a neonate? Why would you strap the infant out? Why isn't it done later in life when they become sexually active and things like that? Or why isn't it the decision of the owner of the body part itself, right? And so the fact that these questions aren't being asked is really concerning. The fact that my parents thought that they could go ahead and alter my body in this incredibly personal way. This is my sexual organ. This is the closest way that I can connect with another human being. And they thought it was permissible to excise without thinking at all, right? They didn't actually critically analyze a penile modification surgery on a child. And I think that's the crux of the issue in America here, is we have just completely lost understanding of basic penile anatomy. And I honestly see this taking place in Europe and other areas as well. Nobody knows what's being removed in a circumcision. They just default to the most trivial thing possible, because it's like, well, it's no way it's that bad, right? It's no way that it could be, something damaging, because otherwise we wouldn't allow it, right? And what I found to be true is the exact opposite. It is not a little snip in most cases. It's not a little bit of tissue removed. It's a radical penile operation that removes important genital structures like your prepuce, your frenulum. In my case, the entirety of my frenulum was removed. It was just gouged out of the underside of my penis. This uniquely erotic structure was taken from me at 1 day old, right? My prepuce was excised. And we're going to get more into the anatomical details here shortly. And then in addition, the ridged band area. If you don't know what these structures are, then you can't really comment on infant circumcision. You can't really actually give your own opinion on it because you don't understand what's even being done to these infants. And somehow I see this taking place in Europe and around the world. Nobody knows what's going on, and everyone does anything they can to trivialize that. Obviously, that's not everyone, but I've seen that happen time and time again in
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it's true. And what you also see very easily, especially in a Northern American and US context, is research being done one after the other to try to justify the usability or the advantages of circumcision, but you see very little research and findings and articles about the anatomy of the male penis and the different parts of it. You mentioned the ridged band, for example. That's something that I suppose that many people don't even know what it is. So you almost see more justifications for circumcisions than for the anatomy of the intact penis.
Right. Yeah, that's a very interesting observation. And so, first of all, though, I think you shouldn't even need these studies being present, right? When I look at the mechanics of an intact penis, and I even have a basic primitive understanding of the erotic nature of it, I can understand, why I want to be intact the same way I can understand why I want to have two arms, right? It's that obvious to me. It's embarrassingly, comically obvious to me. And it would be funny if it wasn't so morbid. So I hear what you're saying on that. I don't think any studies should be done, but, that's kind of the situation that we're in, is that they probably do need to be done in order to kind of silence the opposition on this. But the fact that there are all these studies which have extreme flaws to them, based on my own opinion and the opinion of some other subject matter experts on this topic, they have an agenda. There's like a circumcision lobby, right? There are vast amounts of resources put into furthering this agenda of legitimizing circumcision of neonates, of juveniles, of children, of adults as well, and legitimizing this procedure as this extreme medical solution to many problems. Maybe not extreme, that might not be appropriate in this case, but it's certainly the medical justifications for this are abundant everywhere, but many people have started challenging this. And I am not an expert on the medical metrics, right? And that's not necessarily something that I feel comfortable speaking to at this time. And the reality of the situation is, for me, I don't care about the medical metrics. I would never have a single centimeter removed from my penis, even if there was 100% reduction in every sexually transmitted disease, right? Not even a centimeter I would be allowed to have taken off of my body. And so that's where, I really think the consent issue comes into play here. Is I'm not consenting to penile modifications for any reason, unless, I have gangrene or frostbite or something like that, where there is no solution and the tissue has to be excised. That's where I stand on this. And it's very serious to me.
But I think something that is so difficult as well, when people say, oh, I've never heard anyone have an issue with this. My boyfriend's biggest dream in his life is to get his body part back. And there is no way to do that. And he feels so sexually assaulted. And he says, this is not just some practice that should be allowed. This is rape. This is sexual assault. This is so bad that, allowing this to be legal is like saying, oh, it's legal to rape little boys.
Yeah, and definitely. Sorry, I was going to chime in there and just say that in addition to what you both said, that consent should start at birth. In the Nordic countries, we speak a lot about consent and consent legislation for sexual relationships, and also in the context of rape and sexual abuse. But it should be really natural that consent for the integrity of one's own body starts at birth.
Absolutely. And so I'm not sure if Erica wants to chime in, but I'll jump in here really quick. I think that's a very interesting way to frame this discussion, though, because what the opposition likes to say on this topic, or the other side, is that infants and young children, they don't consent to a lot of different things. We're not going to get into this, right? But vaccinations are one. Oh, well, the children don't consent to vaccinations. So that's within the parent's jurisdiction. And I don't want to get onto that tangent really quick, but the issue for me is it's much less about consent. And I think that's kind of an interesting way to frame this, and an interesting perspective to offer. But for me, it's what was done to me is genital mutilation, right? It's not circumcision or something like this. It's just damaging my body. And so I don't understand why an adult would ever do this unless they had some dire medical need to get it done. And I look at it in the same way. Why would you take your eye out, right? Why would you cut any part of your, it's not even an alteration or an enhancement or something like that. It's just destruction of body parts. It's not even really modifying it. It's just destroying it. And so I think people should be able to recognize that that is a destructive thing to do. It's not even, and this is certainly my opinion on this and how I view it. And my understanding is fluid. It always seems to evolve and change. It's not static. I just want people to keep that in mind. And right now, what I think is that why would a man ever do this? This is less about an issue of consent for me and just like, what's going on here? If you want to make that decision an adult, that's one thing. But individuals should not really expect a man to think this way. And that's kind of how it is in the United States. Like, this is framed as a choice. But for me, it was never about that the choice was taken from me. It's that I was mutilated. And that's a complex thing to break down. But yeah, the issue is not consent for me personally. It's just that somebody damaged. I would never have done this. So I would never have consented to this. But I can see how other people view it as an issue of consent. That's just internally in my own mind. I just look at it as this felonious crime that happened to me. Not that I didn't consent to it. Just, obviously that's a component of it, but that would have never been in the discussion for me to begin with. I would have never consented to a penile modification, and that's kind of my framework in life on this issue.
It's very interesting that you bring forward this very personal view of yours on this, Carter, because I am starting to think now that this concept and discussion of consent might probably be what the outsiders, what is useful for the surrounding or overall discussion more than for the individual, at least in your case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm not sure if Erica wants to respond on that.
I just think the whole idea of people thinking they have a right to remove body parts from a fragile infant without one thought about if this is what that person would have wanted when they grow up is completely insane. And I've seen the amount of damage it does psychologically, physically, and the effects it has on the relationship.
Absolutely.
And my boyfriend has been put in a situation where he has lost a body part. No one ever had a thought about if this was what he wanted or not. And he is the one who has to live with the consequences of someone else's choice. And you can't put the choice of another human being's body in the hands of another person than that person. So, yeah.
Absolutely. So I think the topic of consent, it's still a little abstract to me, because on one hand, right, my parents consented to a lot of things that now I'm comfortable with. And I think the nature of this makes it something where certain things parents can consent to, right? And then in society, we say certain things parents can't consent to. And I think what we need to navigate towards is, this is one of those things, right? A permanent penile modification. That's one of those things that only the individual can consent to.
Mm-hmm.
Only because of the gravity of the situation, because it is this significant alteration to your body.
And it can't be undone.
It can't be undone.
And it's also, like your parents choosing which school you go to or whatever. That is something that, okay, they choose which school you go to, and then you do whatever you want with that when you get older.
Right.
The problem with this is that it's a decision they make when concerning their child, but then the child has to live with those consequences for the rest of his life, and it can't be undone, and it can't really be, it's so difficult to do something about it, and you can't change the consequences.
Right.
And I think that's one of the biggest differences as well.
Yeah, I think you put it really well there, Erika, when you said that he is the one who has to live with the consequences of another person's choice.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And the consequences suck.
Yeah. On to the next topic.
Also, yeah, what I just got to think of here is, one person said to me like this: in addition to this having been done to me, it's almost worse knowing that it doesn't stop, that this customs or ritual goes on being performed.
Absolutely, yeah. So I can briefly share how I feel about this. Now that I started speaking up about it, knowing that there are children around me having unnecessary, damaging penile modification surgeries that excise their precious tissue, right? That's how I look at this now. I'm like, this is such unique tissue on the human body. It's erotically charged, right? It stimulates your brain in a unique way. This is important, precious tissue. That's just being robbed from a child in a violent way, right? They're strapping these children down, maybe not always strapped down, held down, whatever, and cutting away at this very unique and important tissue from their body. That is completely destabilizing for me psychologically. And I want to make it clear that I absolutely care about the infants and the juveniles that are being affected by this, but that understanding also affects me and how uncomfortable I am with that. I don't feel comfortable knowing that's going on. And it destabilizes me psychologically. Of course, I care that it's happening to infants, but I also care that I don't ever feel like I can live comfortably. It's that much of an issue for me. And I have that deep of an understanding on this topic. And I would fight regardless, right, if I had these own personal concerns. But that's why I fight so hard, is because it is a wild situation going on right now. That parents think that and doctors think that they have any footing to stand on to remove these structures from children. And when I really do think about it, it is the darkest thought that I've ever had, right? The understanding of what's going on, it's like the greatest pain that I've ever known in my life. It is so disgusting what they're doing. It is so damaging. It is so violent. It is so perverse. I can't live comfortably. And when I speak out about it and people trivialize me and diminish the situation and things like that, it's like I'm in a prison in my mind. Every day of my life, I suffer from this understanding that children are being harmed in this way. And I continuously feel a state of unease that never seems to fully dissipate. It's just there in the background. You know, there's so many issues going on in the world, right? So many issues, but this one's so personal to me, and I have such a deep understanding of it, and it's so unnecessary. The solution is so easy, right? You just stop cutting children's penises. It's so easy. And I really, when I do speak out about it and I do share my feelings, at least a lot of the times in my community, they will trivialize what's going on. And I am vulnerable about it, right? I'm like, I've been harmed by this. I know other men who have been harmed by this. I represent men when I speak with you that have been harmed by this. And they just throw that testimony out to the side and say, I'm doing this to my child. You're not going to convince me. My child, my choice. And understanding the consequences of this, like I do, it's legitimately heartbreaking. I go back and I've, sat in the shower and cried. I've sat in my bed and cried, like, please, I hope this person does not do this to their child. The consequences of this, they don't understand. They don't know what they're doing. And it really does drive me insane. Really, it really does. And insane probably isn't the right word, but destabilized is. I can't live comfortably. So I did want to share my thoughts surrounding kind of what you shared there and how I feel about this topic. I think that rarely gets shared, is how men feel, who have been affected by this, feel about the situation that's going on, and why we really go and out of our ways, certain men do, and speak out about this and risk everything, our personal brand, our professional brand, because we know the consequences and we know how unnecessary this is and why it shouldn't be done. But we also feel it. It's not just a sympathy thing. We feel the pain that's going to be inflicted on the child. We feel that, and anyone who has any sense of justice is going to begin speaking out about that once they really understand the true consequences.
Yeah, I'm thinking one thing is what was being done to you yourself or any person, but then still another dimension is if you have had this done to your own child. That must add, I think, a dimension of difficulty to handle with it very much.
I think parents never want to find out that they've done something they shouldn't do or shouldn't have done. But I think that this issue causes so much suffering that, they can't get away with this. The amount of pain this practice causes it's the worst I've ever experienced. And I've never seen someone hurt as much as my boyfriend does. And, knowing every day that I need to keep an eye on the TV, radio, everything like that, so that there won't be anything that's going to trigger him to have panic attacks and all that. It is so exhausting, and it could have been avoided so easily if his parents had just stopped to think, okay, is this what he will want when he grows up? How will this affect him when he grows up?
Yeah, that is really a difficult thing. And this got me thinking. I don't know if any one of you, maybe you, Carter, would be able to comment on this. If you are born lacking a leg or an arm, or you can't move it, or you can't use your eye for vision, or something like that, it is what it is. I can't really relate to how you can cope with that, but somehow I think this issue to such a big degree is unnecessary. So it adds even more difficulty, I would suppose, to know that this would not have been needed to happen.
Absolutely, yeah. So it is the unnecessariness of the situation that does bother me as well. But I also, losing an arm, losing many body parts like an eye or something like that, that is obviously extremely challenging to deal with. I think this issue has a unique distinction to it, though, because it's my sexual tissue. And so I'm not trying to diminish losing these other body parts. I'd be devastated if I lost an arm or I lost an eye. And I'm devastated that I lost these genital structures, right? But there's this unique facet to the human experience, which is your sexuality, right? And when you lose an arm, it doesn't impact that. It doesn't impact this sense. It's almost like a unique sense. You know, you can see, touch, hear, smell, but and typically your sexual energy and your sexual erotic tissue that gets put into touch, but it almost is its own unique distinction. And for that to have been affected for me and to lose this erotically charged tissue, and we're going to get into the anatomical components of this in a second, so the rest, you know, so other people listening in can really understand what is taking place here and why it's so impactful for the men. If you believe that this is just a little snip or a little bit of tissue that's been removed, you know, you're going to be in for an awakening here, because we're going to go over a detailed anatomical analysis of what's taking place on the body. So in a minute here, I'm going to share my screen and we will cover that. I'm not sure, Johan, do you think this is a good transition?
I think I would just like to add one thing.
Sure.
And one thing that really made me understand how badly this is hurting my boyfriend is that he told me that he would rather they had taken one of his arms than his foreskin, because he has lost all sexual sensitivity, all sexual like he's lost all
energy.
Yeah, and all this.
It's not so
just because he knows that, you know, he's not going to feel anything. There's no real point in having sex. There's no real point in being intimate because he can't feel anything anyway.
Yeah. Yep. It's a pretty difficult conversation to even have. I even right now, I'm feeling a lot of emotions surrounding this, and things really start escalating quite quickly when you start talking about the anatomical loss. And even men who are aware of this issue and are activists on it and have explored it in depth, these conversations are extremely difficult for them because the reality is so grim for so many of us, right? And that's what I want to highlight with these anatomical illustrations. Some men, right, might be comfortable losing components of their body. I think most men that were circumcised neonatally or as juveniles, they have no conceptual understanding of this at all. It's completely abstract in their mind. And the reason I say that is because I experienced that myself, right? I had no understanding myself at all. I mean, it's crazy to say, but intact or uncircumcised, I prefer the terminology intact, that understanding was completely lost to me. It's not like it wasn't kind of in the picture for me. I had no understanding at all, right? And only when I began exploring the anatomical significance of these structures that are commonly excised via neonatal circumcision and circumcision in general, did I begin to really comprehend the loss, that the physical loss that I've experienced. And it's the physical loss that causes the psychological consequences for me. It's the sensory feedback that's highly diminished for me and disrupted my inability, I feel like, to properly bond with someone at many times, right? This organ allows you to experience this incredible bonding moment with another human being, the closest way that you can connect with a human being. And that has been radically altered for me, diminished. It feels like a destruction, to be honest. And that's difficult for me to even admit, but that's where I am. And so what I want to bring up next is that there's a spectrum to the loss that exists within circumcision. Some of the audience might be familiar with the spectrum that exists within FGM. And there is a range of tissue that's removed and entire structures that are removed via circumcision, right? So it's not this singular procedure with a singular outcome. There's a wide range of tissue and structures that are excised. And that's what I want to demonstrate here when I share my screen and we go over some illustrations, some anatomical illustrations. What these illustrations break down is a concept, or not necessarily a concept, but an index. It's called the coverage index. And so this is what the restoration community, a community of individuals that are trying to restore their foreskin through stretching methods, either with a device or manual stretching, they'll pull the remaining foreskin remnant that they have and try to induce mitosis, or the growth of new cells, right? And so they'll try to expand their remaining foreskin to create a pseudo fake foreskin that has some, you know, I can't speak to whether the properties of that tissue resemble the actual foreskin itself or not. But enough on that tangent. We'll just get into the illustrations here. Oh, go ahead, Erica.
I just want to add something because you mentioned FGM.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one issue is that a lot of the people who are involved in the, you know, protecting girls from the FGM and all this, what they don't understand when they say that FGM is so much worse than genitally mutilating boys is that they're losing supporters. Because I know one big trigger for my boyfriend, and also one reason that he doesn't really care about the whole FGM question, is that no one is talking about protecting boys' bodies. So why should he put any energy whatsoever into protecting girls' bodies? And I think that is something that they just haven't understood.
That is a really important point. And I have noticed that in the last year or last few years, maybe, those organizations working with doing prevention work for FGM, female genital mutilation, if we spell it out, they more and more start to speak about the importance of involving men in this work. How can they be involved to enable the prevention in a better way in those communities where female genital mutilation is being done, and it is given much thought. But what is very seldom mentioned is what you just said, Erika, that the best way to get those men involved is to include them in the sphere of those that are protected from this procedure.
Yeah.
Okay, Carter, go ahead. And you are actually going to show some anatomical illustrations of a penis. So just that the viewers are aware of this, that this is what we are going to see now.
Absolutely, yeah. So if you want to turn away, this would be the time to do it. But it's not actual photographs, right? It's just illustrations. So you're not going to see actual images of penises here. So I'm going to share my screen. And the first thing that we're going to go into is the different index positions that are in the coverage index, or the classification system that the restoration community has come up with to categorize the different types of tissue removal and structure removal that exists within male circumcision. So this is on foreskinrestoration.men, a really great website that men go to learn about foreskin restoration. And recently they came out with these very nice anatomical illustrations that really help break down the anatomical loss that is present. So it starts out at CI 0, right? So this stands for coverage index 0. And we can see here an illustration of a flaccid penis and what this type looks like, or what this index position, or, you know, where this is on the range. And they give a description here. We probably can't see this, but in the the CI0 stage, the circumcision scar line is very far back on the penile shaft, which is a characteristic of excessive skin removal. This results in the typical two-tone circumcised penis. And I've found this type to be very common among American men who were cut neonatally, either between CI0, CI1. That's not always the case, but a lot of the men that I've spoken with start out in this range. This is purely anecdotal, right? We don't have the actual metrics that we need to start coming to conclusions on this right now. But this is around where I started at personally for myself. And so I can really speak well to what the anatomical consequences are here. So even when my penis was flaccid, all of the membrane tissue on my shaft right here would be exposed, right? And so first of all, what I want to highlight is that a huge quantity of the membrane tissue was excised in general, right? If you were to retract an intact man's penis, the membrane tissue would nearly go to the base, right? If you could pull it back all the way and get it down, you would see membrane tissue nearly to the base of the penis. And so a significant amount of that has been excised for me, right? And I'm left with only this membrane tissue remaining. And really, it looks more than it is because it's tight, even when it's flaccid, right? It's like being stretched, even when it's flaccid. And so it looks maybe like more membrane tissue than it really is because it's being stretched out to accommodate the size of the shaft. And so when this membrane tissue is exposed, you have to, when we talk about membrane tissue, you know, people can quickly understand, you know, the properties of membrane tissue because you have membrane tissue in your mouth. Women have membrane tissue, you know, their clitoris is membrane tissue. The underside of their clitoral hood is membrane tissue. I'm not an anatomical expert, right? So I can't say that for certain, but the inside of their vagina is membrane tissue, right? And so my membrane tissue is completely exposed and doesn't really resemble membrane tissue anymore at all. It's a process happens called keratinization on exposed tissue where keratin proteins adhere to the tissue and form like a thick layer over it. And in general, it just seems to deteriorate. The quality of the tissue, the properties of the tissue, they're really changed when it's not in the proper membrane environment. And this is a very abstract concept to break down, but typically on an intact man or a man that's farther down on the CI index or the coverage index, this membrane tissue is covered by membrane tissue itself, right? So it's and we'll see that as we get farther down. And so this has a very different sensation. And also you lose the functionality, the most basic penile functionality, the primary stimulatory mechanism for a man, right? This is a huge loss because typically, and you can see this better on the erect penis, there's no movement here, right? So this tissue has to be stimulated, you know, either with some lubricant, right, or, you know, sexual activity as well. But it doesn't move, right? This is just a taut, tight skin system here. And so during, you know, masturbatory movements or even sex in general, it's this very tight, drum-tight experience where you're not getting the proper stimulation because that mechanism, that functionality, right? People like to say that circumcision doesn't affect functionality, where all of that movement, all of this tissue that can move up and down, this membrane tissue that can stimulate the shaft and the glands, that's been removed. And that's a huge difference in your ability to properly be stimulated. It's a radical difference in your ability to be properly stimulated sexually. And for some men, that might be okay. But for me, right, I look at my body and I feel my body and I'm like, oh my God, what was done to me? This is an extreme modification of my body. And any intact man that can see this doesn't even capture the true nature of what has been done. This tissue, you know, it still almost looks like membrane tissue. The reality is it's this dried, keratinized husk. And that completely changes the experience that you can have sexually. The tissue doesn't resemble membrane tissue really anymore. And you lose the functionality, right, of the gliding mechanism that stimulates the whole shaft and the glands. That's gone. So you're left with this very diminished sexual experience. And it's not just this little difference, right? What I'm trying to highlight is I can fully understand that this is a radical difference. This is a radical diminishment for me. The loss is devastating psychologically and physically. And so I'll briefly cover a couple of these other slides here. But as you can see, typically, you know, as somebody's restoring more tissue, it's going to get looser, right? And so you can see here maybe a couple more wrinkles in the skin. So you're starting to get some of that movement back. They're restoring a little bit of the membrane tissue. And as you move farther down, you can really see here on the CI2 that the membrane tissue is now covered on the shaft, right? And this doesn't really do it justice here, but even the membrane tissue when it's erect is a little bit covered, and you get a little bit more of the gliding action. Some of it's protected. And then as you go farther down this index, you're starting to get more and more tissue. And that really changes the sexual experience because you're able to, there's movement again. And I'm restoring myself, right? And that movement is a completely different sexual experience. And I find that I'm now getting even more and more upset as I'm restoring because I'm realizing the gravity of what was taken from me. I'm realizing the severity of what was done. And as I get a little more movement, that's completely changing. Even the little amount of tissue that I've regained has completely changed the sexual response that I get back and from stimulation. And I've realized how much that means to me, my sexual experience. I'm not embarrassed or ashamed to talk about this anymore. Say, I don't, you know, I'm uncomfortable saying that, you know, I'm looking to have more pleasure from my penis. I look at this as this amazing thing. Your sexual experience, the way you connect with another person, it's like this natural drug that, you know, it's an important facet of the human experience, your sexual energy, your sexual stimulation, things like that. And to have that robbed from me and be left with something, be left with a body part that I'm devastated to have, it's really, you know, that cannot even be said in words. The experience that I have personally, coming to grips with this and seeing the result of what was done to me, right? That really has to be communicated. I'm not embarrassed to say these things. When I'm masturbating or when I'm having sex, I understand the loss. This is what I want to communicate. And there are times where I am, you know, devastated as I'm supposed to be having these beautiful moments. Seriously, that's how I look at it. Like, this is such an important thing, your sexual experience, to what has been done to me. This is insane. I didn't want this. I didn't want a penile modification. I didn't want my sexual experience disrupted like this. And I think, you know, people might begin to understand it, but the real gravity of the situation, to have my body altered like this, radically altered, and to lose this component, it's not a little diminishment for me. It's a radical change and I feel like I've lost something so important. And those feelings only increase as I go through this process of restoration, which won't give me everything back. It won't give me everything that I deserve, that I was born with, that I should have back. And so we'll keep going down this index here just so you guys can see, you know, that I can already tell on my own body. Once I start getting farther along here, this is going to be a completely different sexual experience for me. And that's just such a weird thing to think about, that I'm changing my sexual experience, that somehow I'm going from having this completely different sexual experience to this new type of, you know, sexual energy and sexual stimulation that I can get back. That's just such a weird thing, but it's so true. It's so accurate that I can go from having this complete diminishment, and at least there's something I can do to improve upon this and have a different experience. And I've already had that, you know, transformative understanding that this is not how things are supposed to be for me. The feedback loop that I get from stimulation, it's not right now. There's something really off there, and it's so clear to me in my head what is off. As I go down and I look through, right, this anatomical illustration and this breakdown, I can see here this movement right here when it's erect, right, being able to maybe move up above the glands and things like that. It looks so small, right? The differences look so small, maybe to some of the viewers here and things like that. But think of how small, like, the clitoris is and other genital structures. These tiny little changes really influence the sensation feedback that you get. when your penis is stimulated, completely changes it. Even this 1 millimeter of tissue increase completely changes your sexual experience, and how much that matters to me, you know, is so interesting, I think, for people to hear. And other people, like, they just go their whole lives, you know, if they're intact, not having to worry about these things. But when you are, I consider myself mutilated, right? That's a part of my identity. When you kind of go and restore that, that proper sexual response to whatever degree that you can, that's this crazy, eye-opening experience to understanding what was actually done to you. They robbed your sexuality. That's how I feel. My sexual energy is coming back. It's like a reawakening experience. And this is going to start sounding strange to people, I think, but that's the reality for me. That's what I'm experiencing, is this reawakening of my sexual drive as I'm getting more and more tissue. And so I want people to understand that it's not just the loss of stimulation. It's like a sexual energy that I feel is coming back to myself, and it'll never be the same. But, you know, at least there is something that I can try to do. And it takes a long time, right? It takes a long years of stretching every day to start making results. Sorry, I went on a long tangent there, Johan.
No, I'm very glad that you did. It sounds very somehow encouraging and empowering to hear you say that even a millimeter makes a difference,
Right.
in the right direction. Would you say that the restoring you are doing, that it is like a well-working coping mechanism for you in the loss, the grief you feel about this?
Unfortunately, I think that it definitely is the case for some men, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen briefly. I think that's definitely the case for some men, but for me, it's very difficult, right? Because then I have to analyze the damage when I'm doing it pretty much every time I start restoring. And I was cut tight enough right at that CI0 level that I can't really use a device yet. I'm just about to be able to use a device, but right now I have to manually pull on my tissue, and this is a humiliating experience. It is. I can't even, you know, really go into detail on how humiliating this is, as I'm pulling my foreskin remnant up, right, and just sitting there and having to sit there and like really comprehend what was done to me. It's humiliating. It's embarrassing. I shouldn't feel that way, but I do, right? It's dehumanizing. It's a dehumanizing experience. I'm like, I should not have to be doing this. I was mutilated. I was mutilated as a child, and I have to spend years of my life, hours every day. I spend hours a day doing this because it matters that much to me. And so it's not a good feeling, I'd say. But the progress, the results are very empowering. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm changing my sexual experience completely. And that has psychological impacts. Like, I feel more satisfaction from sexual activity, not just a little bit, right? But a huge difference in the sexual side. And that like lingers for a time, right? I now have started to experience afterglow effects, right? And it has like a different neurological response when you start improving the sensory feedback that you get from your organ. Everyone wants to say that it's in your brain, and that's partially true, but it's stimulated through the stimulation of the sex organ. Anyway.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, and what I'm thinking here, a thing that we also might want to point out about restoration is that even though we use that term, it does not follow, and it does not mean that you can restore the full function of the anatomy. So that should also be remembered, that it's not something you as a parent could think of that you can do and then undo after that your child can undo it afterwards when he has grown up.
Absolutely. And I know I've been speaking a lot. I want to let Erica get a chance. But the other component that I wanted to highlight was it's not just, right? This is highlighting more of the PrEP use. I'm not sharing my screen anymore, but I'll briefly share my screen here one more time and we'll go from there. I know we're going a little over here though. So there's another side to this, right? And so the underside of the penis is where the frenulum lies. And this is a uniquely erotic structure on the penis. And this index does not accurately capture that loss in there. And so many men, though, have a range of frenulum loss or frenular tissue loss. And for me, right, I have 100% removal of my frenulum where nothing has been left remaining for me. Almost like a separate incision was made on my penis as a child, and he just carved out the entire structure. And, you know, there's no restoring that, right? There's no getting that back. And this is very difficult for me to accept, that there's nothing I can do about that loss at this time. And I just have to accept that. That is a really morbid thing for me to think about, that this very, in my opinion, important erotic structure has been taken from me in a similar way, right? I can't compare this to female anatomy, but we consider, you know, removing the, you know, taking any part of the clitoris off as this devastating consequence. This is my genital tissue. These are my erotic structures being removed. I am so uncomfortable with the fact that this tissue was removed from me, and my frenulum was taken out, and my prepuce was cut away, and we really don't see the ridged band very well in these illustrations. But that's another uniquely erogenous structure that on an intact penis, right, it's sitting kind of more at the tip here, and it's never going to be the same. You're not going to have a real ridged band if you were to restore, but typically on an intact man, right, that's going to be at the very end. And when it's erect, this isn't really showing when the prepuce can be pulled back here. But anyway, around right here, right, this is where the ridged band lies when your penis is erect. And it's this unique erogenous zone. And I'll never be able to get that back, right? There's a way to make a pseudo one, but that's a permanent loss for me. And that doesn't sit right with me at all. To lose my genital structures, I can't understand why a man would be comfortable with this. I'm not speaking for other men, right? But it's such an alien and foreign concept to me to think about, how could anyone be comfortable with losing their genital structures? But that's a decision that an adult can make. But it will never make sense to me. I accept it, but it will never make sense to me.
I hear what you are saying, Carter. And speaking about millimeters, what we also should remember is that when one performs this cut to an infant boy, a millimeter also makes a huge difference, because it is quite impossible really to know exactly where to cut an infant boy's penis that then grows very much until he gets adult, and then the result, you will not know where the result is based on those illustrations that you showed there.
Absolutely. And I'm looking in the future to do, start creating my own content and producing my own videos. And that I'm going to really break that down very accurately with illustrations of infant penises that highlight, right? Because we really need to get this to the attention of parents and other people. This is not a little snip. And that's very accurately communicated with these anatomical illustrations on an infant. It's a radical change oftentimes. And like I said, there is a spectrum that exists, but people need to understand, and it's unfortunate that I even have to do that project, right, and put that type of content out there. That's the last thing that I want to do. That's traumatizing for me. I don't want to source infant penis pictures and have an artist create anatomical illustrations and disseminate and share those with people so I can get the point across. But that's where we're at. People will remain ignorant on this topic until they're forced into an understanding. Not everyone, of course, right? But it's like they want to remain ignorant, because then there's no work that has to be done. I'm maybe speaking a little out of turn here, but that's what I've noticed is people don't want to engage on this issue because there's not much to gain and a lot to lose.
I think that's a very valuable observation, really. Erika, would you still have something to add or comment upon this, what Carter just said here?
Well, I think he really has a point in that if people start understanding the extent of the damage, I think the guilt people are going to feel is going to be so extremely bad that, that's just a feeling they want to avoid at all costs. And the problem is that by avoiding it, they're causing even more damage because they're trivializing the pain these affected men are feeling, making the trauma so much bigger for the affected men as well.
I think that's a very important thing to point out. Thank you very much, Erika, for saying that. And I think we are getting near the end of our session.
Yeah.
It has been a very rewarding one. Would any one of you still have something you would like to add before we end here? Carter or Erika? Yeah, go ahead.
One thing that people really haven't realized is that if the man is circumcised, that has a huge impact on the sex life for the women as well. Because on an intact penis, the skin can move, everything is really smooth, and I didn't even know that sex could be painful before I started dating a circumcised guy because the skin is so much rougher. The skin can't move properly. And I know I get sores so easily just because the skin is so rough, and especially the glands get super, super rough. And the best description I've heard is it's having having a nail file shoved into your vagina, and it just starts scraping everything, and it really, really hurts that sensitive tissue. And that's not the way sex is supposed to be. It changes that whole dynamic. And also when you're in a relationship and you're not able to make the sex work, it causes a lot of frustration that sort of seeps into the rest of the relationship as well. So you always have to find ways to compensate for that, which I just think it's so insane that is something. It's 2020 and we're discussing if it should be legal or not, and why it's a bad idea to genitally mutilate little boys. And people don't seem to have any sort of understanding for what problems it actually causes.
Thank you, Erika, for bringing that up. I think that's very important and also a very powerful insight that genital cutting can affect you seriously, no matter if you are a man or a woman, if it's done to you. But it might also affect you in a negative way, even if it's not you yourself that have been cut, but your partner. And at least in European or Nordic context, this is something that is not spoken about very much at all, I would say. So this was very powerful that you brought this up, Erika. Thank you very much for that. Anything more from your end, Carter, before we end?
Yeah, there's just a question I'd like to ask Erika.
Go ahead.
What was your experience when you first saw your boyfriend's penis, I guess, and you've had experience, right, with intact men, and you understand, anatomically what's going on there.
Yeah.
When you saw, the consequences for your boyfriend, what was that emotional experience like?
It was so heartbreaking. It was just purely heartbreaking because intact guys are so much more sensitive. They're so much more vocal, and they just overall enjoy sex so much more. With a circumcised man, all the sensitivity is gone, so he doesn't really enjoy sex just because he can't feel it. And it was also very difficult because when the guys intact, everything is very instinctual. You don't really have to think. With a circumcised guy, you have to be, in one way, a lot rougher if they're going to feel anything. But at the same time, you have to be so much more careful not to stretch the scar line and things like that, which is really frustrating because you always have to think about what you're doing, and you always have to make sure to not hurt the skin, and you always have to make sure that you put pressure in the right places, trying to find somewhere where they can feel something. And it just makes sex so much more complicated.
Right. Right. Yeah. So I 100% understand at a very intimate and detailed level what you're saying. And that's so difficult to communicate with other people. And the gravity of that is also really significant. And, you know, I've never really thought about it from the woman's side of things, but I can start to begin thinking about it from my perspective. If my partner, right, my girlfriend, my, you know, somebody that I was seeing had this anatomical loss, and I had experience with intact women, and suddenly I would be so devastated to know that happened. I would do exactly what you're doing and fight, right? Fight for that, you know, understanding to be shared, and the, you know, justice and to be had for the individual, my partner, that was affected by this. But
I think this affects the relationship on so many levels. This has become the only way for me to deal with it. And my boyfriend isn't dealing with it because he says that there's no point, no one's going to care. I have to make someone care because the loss is so devastating. And just knowing that, okay, for the rest of our lives, we're probably never going to have a sex life that works because of something his parents did. His parents made a decision that has cost us our entire sex life. And that sucks. That's the only way to describe it. It just sucks.
I'm very glad that you manage, Erika, to bring forward this very difficult aspect. And I was going to ask you also about that coping mechanism that I asked Carter. As I may understand, this is being active, like you are now here, speaking very openly and vulnerably about this, I suppose might work as a coping mechanism. Would you say that your boyfriend has or could reach any coping mechanism to process this on his end?
I think his coping mechanism is doing whatever he can, no matter how stupid it is, just making sure that he doesn't have to think about it. And he just tries to avoid dealing with it to, you know, any extent he can. And I think that's the difference between being the one who, well, has been sexually abused and the one who's been genitally mutilated. That the focus there is more on trying not to think about it, trying to find a way to just push it to the back of their mind, not having to deal with it. When you're the partner, I can never relax. I have to always make sure that there's nothing going to be on TV that's going to trigger him. There's nothing on the radio that's going to trigger him. No one's going to say anything that's going to trigger him. And it's exhausting always having to look for those triggers so that I can remove them from the picture before they reach him. And this has become my only way to deal with it.
I see what you are saying. This I am thinking now that this is such a unique and important insight into this that we very seldom hear about, and I'm glad that we are able to carry on the conversation like this. And if both or any of you still have anything that you would want to develop on this or another part of the topic, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I think we can, you know, I'd like to just share one last comment, and that's, you know, when I hear Erika speak about, you know, how she supports her boyfriend and, you know, how she's very nurturing towards the situation, like that is something incredible to me. And I really wanted to give that feedback to her and just share that with other people as well, is that the partners that I've dealt with have really been on the other side of this, that have diminished and trivialized, even made fun of me for bringing up the trauma that I've experienced. And this is really horrific psychologically to deal with. And when I first heard Erica start speaking about this topic, you know, I had pretty much put like my romantic passion aside for a long time now. And just hearing her speak about this, it's like a very hopeful situation for me. I'm like, wow, there's maybe a chance, right? I could have a partner who's so supportive of the situation. Right now, how it's being treated in America, at least, it's very difficult to gain any empathy or understanding at all on this topic. And not even just that, it's difficult for people to take you seriously on it. And so I know the situations are different in the Nordic region and things like that, but I think what Erica's doing is really something incredible. The level of passion she has, the level of understanding. When I first spoke with her, I was blown away by the depth of understanding that she had on this issue. And that is really something that a lot of us victims are looking for. Is the first way to help us move forward is for the understanding from communities and people out there that, you know, right now, a lot of the times what we're experiencing is really a type of psychological abuse that is really heinous. And that's a whole topic for another time. But that has put me in a dark place again and again and again. And when I first heard Erica's level of support and her understanding, it was this eye-opening experience for me. And I finally, you know, she felt like this incredible ally in the situation. And that had a significant transformative effect on how I view, you know, this issue and how I view potential progress in the future and things like that. And so I'm really optimistic about being able to really help victims through this level of understanding and through this nurturing attitude. Like, we know what you went through and we're here to support you. We're allies, things like that. I don't have that experience really ever. And when I had it with Erica, you know, it really changed my outlook on my life. I mean, that's honestly the truth. It sounds, you know, it's those little tiny things that have such a powerful impact on the people affected by this. That's the last thing that I wanted to comment on.
Thank you, Carter, very much for that. As you said, this is such an important topic, and there are many other subtopics that could still be dealt with, but that might be for another session. As I said in the beginning, the viewers may ask questions, and there should be info in the description field of this video on how they can be posed, and they will be answered by Carter and Erica at a later stage. As a complement to the last session we did in May, which I said was more on the academic and scientific side with Brian Earp, this has been a very valuable discussion. I think that after this, none of the viewers that watch this can at least say that, well, I have never heard anyone complain. I think this has been a really unique insight into this from both of your personal perspectives, and I am very grateful that you chose to do this, which certainly must not have been easy. The last thing I am thinking of here is internet is a big help here. Now everyone does not have to be on his or her own anymore, but it is possible to network with each other, support each other, and share experiences. And it's, of course, also thanks to the internet that we can sit here, even if we are at 3 very different places. So with that, I thank you very much, Erica and Carter, and I look forward to meeting you again and continue discussing, possibly in a short future with a question and answer session. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us, even though it's a very, very sad situation and it's very sad that it's needed. But thank you for trying to do something.
Thank you. Bye.
Yeah, really appreciate the opportunity. Later.
Later.
See ya.